Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. In this episode, you will hear from IHRB Salil Tripathi and Mark Taylor from the Clooney Foundation for Justice, who talk about the responsibility of business during armed conflicts.
Hello everybody, this is Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and I'm with Mark Taylor. He has been at IHRB trustee, he's on our advisory council, he's a senior program manager at the Docket project, which is a very interesting project that we will talk about a little bit. And he, along with Anita Ramasastry and Robert Thompson, wrote the path-breaking paper which led businesses realize what their responsibilities were in zones of conflict and how to avoid complicity. So welcome back, Mark.
Thanks, Salil, and thank you for the kind words.
Tell me about the Docket project. What is it all about?
The Docket is an initiative of the Clooney Foundation for Justice. And so we sit under the umbrella of the Clooney Foundation with other initiatives like Waging Justice for Women, Trial Watch. The Docket itself is focused on investigating international crimes. So we use investigation as the basis for trying to prompt prosecutors in different countries to open their own investigations and launch cases against the perpetrators and accomplices of international crimes using universal jurisdiction or some form of extraterritorial jurisdiction that allows them to prosecute international crimes like war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide at home, even when those crimes have happened in faraway places.
So the word you use, which is interesting here, is accomplice. Because most companies that we talk about, when we talk about international crime, they say, oh, we don't do it. We just happen to be there. Sometimes they're silent witnesses, sometimes they're contributing to it, sometimes they're benefiting from it. So what have we learned? And particularly keeping in mind 2 or 3 conflicts we are all aware of right now. Sudan is blowing up as we speak, and Russia has thrown up a lot of questions. So if you were to look at the whole scenario, which is pretty grim, what are the lessons for companies?
I think the overriding lesson remains the one that companies in their own contexts had to face, which is that there are very real liabilities, criminal liabilities that can arise from operations in countries that are either in conflict or descend into conflict. And in the case of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, there's all kinds of Western companies that have made a big show of leaving Russia, and there are some that have stayed and have spent quite a bit of time and energy trying to defend that decision. There are sometimes good reasons for that, right? We talk in the business and human rights space about responsible exit, figuring out how you exit a situation without making the human rights situations worse by doing so. And so those companies should be taking those things into consideration. But on the other hand, there are very real risks that companies who do remain become accomplices to international crimes. And really what we've learned over the past 3 years is that happens in usually 3 ways. Patterns of business activity and relationships. One being the sort of foreign direct investment scenario, where you're invested in a particular country, could be directly, could be through joint venture, other partnerships, but you have some presence on the ground there. The other is in supply chain relationships, where you're a company that's producing something. It might be weapons, it might be dual-use technology, surveillance technology, for example, that is used by the perpetrators of human rights violations and national crimes. And the third is that your business model is reliant on extracting value from a country that's in conflict. Could be the kind of classic situation that you know very well from back in the day because you were a pioneer in that field, but conflict diamond. It could be gold or other minerals from DRC, where rather than a company supplying things into the war zone, they're taking things out. And in the process, they're helping to finance the perpetrators of international crimes. And we are seeing this today in a number of different ways. Our work at the Docket, for example, focuses on antiquities, where the purchasers of antiquities in brokers and galleries in Europe and the United States and other consumer countries can be traced to the financing of ISIS and other terrorists in different countries in the Middle East, for example. diamonds is back again. The world's largest producer of diamonds is in Russia, the Alrosa company. Yes. And there's big debates about sanctions and whether or not to sanction Alrosa. The U.S. has imposed sanctions. But that debate continues. So I would say that overall the risk of liabilities has not gone away. If anything, it has increased because courts are more willing to take these issues. That being said, there are liabilities that have arisen through really the explosion of sanctions measures, the listing of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals and entities since the invasion of Ukraine, where the Russians are facing an unprecedented level of sanctions activity by not just the United States, which has used the sanctions tool as a tool of economic warfare for many, many years, but also from the European Union. And both of those sanctions regimes rely increasingly on human rights principles in an attempt to disrupt the economic activities that help to sustain human rights abuse and international crime.
So one thing we often talked about in all our work that we've both been involved with all these years is the whole notion of collective action. And you just pointed out that there's a slight divergence between US and EU. But then when we look at other countries which are prominent and major players, Russia being one of them, Brazil being another one, India and China, it breaks down. I mean, it's very, very hard. I mean, the old days used to be that you can have sanctions against a convenient, weak target country. Then it's very easy to do that. Myanmar junta at one point, for example. Right. But it's becoming harder and harder. So what should companies be aware of? What are the things that they must know about? And what kind of transparency they should display?
So I think that the overriding reality that companies need to take into consideration is the one that I think certainly for the big multinational companies they are painfully aware of, which is that the era of globalization is over. We live in an era in which national security will disrupt your supply chain in ways that it just didn't, even 5-6 years ago. Think of the way that the controversy around Huawei's participation in the 5G network sort of crept up on us, and all of a sudden overnight it was unacceptable to even think of having a Chinese company provide that kind of technology for Western markets. And since then we've seen the rapid expansion of that, and the war in Ukraine has accelerated that incredibly. We're now in a context in which we're no longer seeking to globalize trade and integration. We're seeking to untangle ourselves from the Russian economy or from the Chinese economy, prevent China from gaining the chips and the technology necessary in the race for dominance, whether it's in artificial intelligence or simply other forms of strategic data processing. So I'm not speaking about all of this in a positive way. I'm just trying to paint a picture that the overriding reality for these companies is now geostrategic. And for the business and human rights community, that has huge significance because we're always operating within those boundaries. Human rights in general operates within those boundaries, and it affects the choices we make really quite radically, and it presents new ones. And I think the dichotomy that you posed by way of a question is a very real one. We're not in that world anymore where it's about the entire world can sort of sanction a particular regime, because as we see in the case of Russia in Ukraine, the entire world is not sanctioning Russia. They are making their choices, and they're telling the Americans, for example, and the Europeans that they want to go about it in a different way. We see this message coming from Brazil and South Africa and India, Turkey, who's technically a NATO ally. So these fault lines have always been there, but they have erupted in a way into a globalized world in a way that really has transformed, I think, not just foreign policy, but the trade policy, and therefore the way the business and human rights community needs to think about our ability to globalize those norms, to globalize those values of protecting human rights through global value chains. Now we have to contend with national security. And that's, in some ways, a really old theme. Human rights and national security were always at loggerheads to a certain extent in international law. But we're facing it again. It's back in a big way on the radar, and the business and human rights community needs to take that into consideration.
So where does that take us as a kind of final question? Are we talking about guiding principles plus?
I think I do think there's two things. I think one is the whole question of state regulation and how states are going to regulate to improve the ethical values within global value chains. I think that that's increasingly a struggle, as I just said, because of national security is an added normative concern, is to put it mildly. It's really an overriding imperative that will get in the way of attempts to make global value chains more pro-poor, more pro-worker, more pro-farmer. So I do think that that's a factor we have to contend with in thinking about state regulation. When we ask our governments to extend their regulatory authority down or up through global value chains by creating human rights due diligence obligations throughout a company's operations, as it is usually stated, we are going to face these kinds of dilemmas that are kind of new variations on old themes, to be honest. So that's one. Two, in addition to state regulation, we really need to be thinking about the way that we assess both the global norms, the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, etc., all of the new corporate ethical guidelines based on those principles of how a company respects human rights, conducts its due diligence, acts with due diligence to respect human rights. We need to be thinking about how we assess both company behavior and the effectiveness of those norms, and on what basis we do so. What do we actually know? And I think for the business and human rights community, for the past few years, we've faced a problem, is that we don't really know very much. We continue to hear from and listen to communities who are affected by negative business impacts, to use the lingo, and that must be and continue to be the bottom line. That is the way we should be assessing whether or not things are improving or not. But there's a vast gulf between that and what companies are saying, where we just don't have knowledge of what's working and what's not, and where, due to the realities of privileged commercial information and corporate secrecy, we can't know. I was for many years a researcher working on business and human rights, and if a company wasn't willing to open up to you, you really had no empirical evidence on which to build an argument that a particular norm was working or a particular regulation was being effective, or frankly, that a particular company's behavior was ethical. So we're operating in a world of black and white, what the company is saying and the effects we're seeing on the ground. I think the solution is a really significant upscaling of investigative capacity within civil society. We rely on civil society organizations, especially those that do investigations. And I'm thinking here of the global witnesses of this world, to pick one. And we rely on investigative journalism as well. We need both of those to get better at what they do. We need more of them, and we need more resources flowing to them. And when we think about the challenges that investigative journalism has faced in recent years in terms of financing, we really have to wonder, okay, is investigative journalism going to be able to continue to do things like build the databases of leaks that they have done with the Panama Papers and subsequent leaks? Those are really the basis on which we investigate corporate activity. It's based on leaks. That's our database, which is extremely patchy.
And it's erratic, and it's entirely dependent on a whistleblower or two.
Exactly. So we need to find ways to protect those whistleblowers, but to encourage them. But we need to move beyond that. And one of the ways I think we need to do that is to think about Freedom of Information Act type requirements that apply to non-state actors' business in particular. So in other words, and here in Norway, there was an innovative bill called the Transparency Act, which was Norway's way of implementing human rights due diligence for Norwegian companies here. And one of the unique things about that bill was the inclusion of a right to know. And that was a right to know for everybody in Norway. All residents could ask, including organizations and trade unions and others, could ask a company about things that were happening in its value chain that affected rights. And they were required, those companies were required by law to reply. And there's a regulator that will sit in judgment over whether that reply is adequate or not. So we need to think about these kinds of creative ways for getting information out into the public domain, improving the critical scrutiny that businesses face, because frankly right now, I think the work that is being done is really valiant, but it's just not enough.
More work for you, for me, and for everybody. Thank you so much indeed.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you.
Salil. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast. That way you'll never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about IHRB's work to make respect for human rights part of everyday business, then head to ihrb.org.